The following program is rated T for teen for the use of tools and materials that can be harmful to unsupervised usage. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello everyone, Mr. Waugh here from Mr. Waugh Media, and yes, that is my actual name. Today's episode, I'm going to show you painting techniques for wooden textures. In a lot of my builds, usually there is some sort of a wooden element, whether it's something like trenches or furniture or floor planks, but wooden texture itself can sometimes be a bit tricky to pull off. So, we've decided to give you 3 different styles. A beginner's, which can be cranked out in a handful of minutes, but still looks pretty good. Sort of an advanced one that's sort of my go-to, I really like the texture of it. And the third is more photorealistic, of something left out in the elements for quite some time, an old decrepit barn or a fence post that the elements is just ravaged with time. These are going to be nice, quick, easy steps that are easy to follow, and we hope that inspire you for your build. Let's get started. Before we get to the main part of the episode with our different color palettes, we first need to talk about a specific technique called dry brushing. Now I know I have touched this on a previous episode, but it's very important here. If you're not aware, dry brushing is where you'll take almost all the paint out of your brush, so that only a trace amount will remain in the bristles. You can wipe this off with a cloth, or you can use your palette, whatever it takes, just remove as much of the paint as you can. Then, you will lightly brush it side to side across the object, and it'll leave a tiny trace amount of the paint behind on the most raised, elevated areas of the surface. Now when it comes to these boards of wood, you actually need to be careful and think about the wooden textures. If you were to follow the grains, you'll actually be defeating the purpose of a dry brush, because the bristles will not only hit those elevated areas, but also slip into the cracks. So instead of having a light raised area and the darker shadows, the effects becomes muddied and it'll all look the same. As you can see here, I'm following the grain, and you can't actually see a difference between the raised areas and the lower sections. A crude analogy, and sort of bear with me on this one, but imagine holding up a comb and taking your brush and going head on into it. All of those bristles are going to get in between each of the teeth, leaving the paint behind. But if you were to take that same comb and the same brush and instead go side to side, in theory the bristles will only be able to hit the upmost part of the teeth. They won't be able to get in between each and every one of them. It's the same with these panels of wood. As you can see here, I'm dry brushing side to side, using the same amount of paint, same amount of force, exactly the same technique except a different direction, and it's already day and night. Instead of it being muddied, you can actually see these little grains of wood. And even though this is a rather, I guess you could say a crude experiment, I think the results speak for themselves. The first one has that muted and kind of muddied look, whereas the second one, you can see the grains of wood. Now this is a basic experiment, like I said, but if we see this big of a difference between some simple black primer and a light dusting of white paint, imagine what the other colors would look like if you were to go the wrong direction with browns and earthy tones. It will make a world of a difference, and that's why texture and technique is so important. Alright, with that out of the way, we're actually going to get to the painting, and I'm going to be a huge hypocrite here and brush with the grain with my black primer. I know, that's shocking. I am a terrible human being. But I want to make sure this is in there really thick and we get into all the nooks and crannies. Alright, since we used a little bit extra paint on the last layer, we got to give it a few extra minutes to dry. But once it does, we're going to go back in there with some brown acrylic paint, and I'm going to start dry brushing it side to side. I know, I keep changing directions. I know this must be confusing, but just bear with me. I'm going to do about 2 coats of brown, lay it in there really nice and thick to give us a solid foundation to work with. As you can see here, this is what it looks like after I finish the second coat. Once that's dried, we're going to go in for our final step. We're going to take some generic white acrylic paint and remove almost all of it from the bristles. This will be a very light dry brushing, almost a dusting. And we're going to go side to side, yep, still go in that direction, and we're going to try to coat the entire panel. And this is going to make a nice effect where all the grains of wood are going to pop out. And while this isn't the most complicated technique, it is rather effective. As you can see here, we have a very nice looking panel, and it only took 5 minutes from start to finish to get this effect. So while I do consider this to be kind of a beginner's position, if you're under a time constraint or if you have large batches, this is an excellent way to do wooden textures. From here, let's now look at the more advanced version. This time around, we're going to take 1 part black and 1 part brown to make sort of a dark chocolatey color.
And we're going to dry brush this across our black primered panel. Black primered panel. There we go. Try saying that 3 times fast. Trust me, I had to do a few takes there just to get it right. But once the paint is on there, I'm going to do 1 solid coat. We can move on to our next step. From here, we're going to take 1 part golden yellow and 1 part brown to make sort of a golden sandy color. I'm going to try to remove as much of it from the bristles as I can. I even have a second palette off screen just to try and wipe off the excess paint. From here, we're going to lightly, can you guess what direction?
Side to side!
Good for you. Have a golden sticker.
Yay!
As you can see, we're going side to side, and it'll leave us with this kind of an effect here. Once that's all fully dried, we're going to go in there with some Agrax Earthshade from Citadel Paints, and we're going to completely cover the entire panel with this stuff. I really like the effect that it leaves behind. It makes it really look aged and worn down, and a little bit grimy as well. From here, we're going to let this sit for quite some time so it's fully dry, and then we'll come in for the next step by taking just pure white, and we're going to dry brush the entire panel in a very light coat. And with that final step out of the way, we are now finished our second panel. As you can see, it's not quite as, not quite as cartoony and wooden in quotation marks as the first panel was. This one has a little bit more depth to it, a little bit more aging. It looks stained and weather-worn. And again, that's no jab at the panel that we did earlier, which still does look really good. But as you can see, the second one has a little bit more realism to it. But we can take it even further than that. To start our third panel, we're going to take 1 part black and 1 part white to make a medium gray. And we're going to dry brush that across our black primered panel. Editor's note here, I'm not going to lie, I'm actually very proud of myself because I said that in 1 take. Unlike the first time around, it took me actually 7 tries. Once that layer is down firmly, we're going to go with some warm white. I've also seen brands that say eggshell white or off-white. In a pinch, you could even take a little bit of brown and add to some regular white, just to make sort of an off color. And we're going to dry brush this relatively lightly across the boards. You'll notice I'm kind of doing it in a weird pattern. I'm hitting some areas a little bit heavier than others. I want this to sort of give the effect of the elements have taken its toll on this panel of wood. Some areas might be water stained, or one might be a little bit more exposed to the elements than the other parts. And we're going to continue doing this with the next step as well. Once this is fully dried, I'm going to go in there with something called Null Oil from Citadel Paints. I'm going to put this on relatively random as well. I'm going to put a big blotch down in the corner, a little along the side, maybe a bit at the top there, and that's about it. Now, while this is still drying, I'm going to take just enough time for me to wipe off my brush before I go back in there with Agrax Earthshade, also from Citadel Paints. And this time around, I'm going to coat the entire thing. And guess what? I'm going with the grain. It's not side to side here. I know. I am a monster. Honestly, I don't know how I live with myself some days, but I mean, hey, the third panel's done, so that's something, right? Let's actually zoom in here, and you can actually see what we were doing with this thing. I really like this one because it does have that natural look. It's something that you've seen before. It's that wooden post that's been left out on a farm. You can see here, this is a panel that we found just doing an image search, and it's really got that aged, decrepit look to it. Like, this is something that's definitely been left out in the elements from the snow, the rain, and the wind. And here's all 3 panels side by side. The great thing about this is most of these panels take 5 minutes to do. The second one takes a little bit longer. There are obviously more steps to it, but these are very easy to crank out. So if you're working with some wooden effects for like fences or floorboards or something as big as a ship, or if you're using furniture, any of these 3 techniques will work for you. The first one is very easy. You can crank it out relatively fast. The second one, I kind of like using that one myself because it is a bit more grounded and I find a little more realistic. And the third one, it has that really nice aged look to it. So depending on what effect you're going for, I really hope that one of these 3 might help you.
Well, that's been today's episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Maybe you found some useful information. If you did, make sure you hit the like, the share, subscribe down below, and please pass this to all your friends. We're really trying to build this from the ground up. And if there's something you want me specifically to build later on, let me know in the comments down below, and hopefully we can get around to it. On that note, I've been Mr. Waugh from Mr. Waugh Media. I hope you were thoroughly entertained. We'll catch you on the next one.
here for a reason? Sometimes I wonder why. Am I here for a reason? Or is life just passing by? Someone please tell